Dr. Evelyn Reed thought she was decoding humanity's greatest mystery. The Voynich Manuscript, 600 years of impossible symbols, botanical illustrations of plants that never existed, star charts mapping alien skies. But when her computer finally cracked the pattern, the truth was far more terrifying than fiction. It wasn't a language at all. It was a recipe, a set of instructions designed to rewrite the human brain. And she had just followed it to completion. Some mysteries are meant to stay buried. In the hushed sanctuary of the dead, dust was the only thing that truly lived. It danced in the single sharp beam of a desk lamp, a silent galaxy of forgotten skin and paper fibers. Below this swirling cosmos sat Dr. Evelyn Reed, a ghost haunting her own past. Towering shelves rose around her into the oppressive darkness, packed tight with the spines of academic journals that no one had opened in decades. They were monuments to theories that had been proven, disproven, or worst of all, forgotten. Her face, a sharp porcelain mask of exhaustion and ferocious intellect, was bathed in the cold blue light of her laptop. On the screen, lines of code cascaded downwards, a digital waterfall of her own design. This was her native tongue, the only one that never lied. She was running a pattern recognition algorithm, a predator of her own making, hunting for anomalies in the syntax of ancient Sumerian cuneiform. It was a private obsession, a project funded by what little she had left, a way to keep the blade of her mind from rusting. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, refining a query, her focus so absolute that the world beyond the lamplight had ceased to exist. Then, a small window popped into existence on her screen. It was brutally simple, a black and white box with stark lettering. Access denied, university network credentials expired. Evelyn froze. Expired. They hadn't just fired her. They hadn't just denounced her work and blacklisted her from any respectable institution. Now, they had taken away her library card. She stared at the words, and a quiet, dark anger began to simmer behind her eyes. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was the slow, methodical burn of a star collapsing into itself. She, who had dedicated her life to the pursuit of knowledge, was now locked out of the temple. She was an exile, and the final gate had just been slammed shut. She closed the laptop with a soft, deliberate click, plunging herself into the suffocating silent dark. Her apartment was less a home and more a sterile containment unit for a restless mind. The walls were white and bare, the furniture minimalist and severe. It felt like a laboratory where the primary experiment of human life had been paused indefinitely. The only flicker of warmth in the entire space came from a single small frame on her desk. It held a photo of a much younger Evelyn, her smile wide and unguarded, standing beside an older woman with kind eyes and the same brilliant spark. Her mother, a relic from a time before. The jarring synthetic chime of an incoming video call ripped through the silence. Evelyn frowned. No one called her. She walked to the monitor, her brow furrowed in annoyance, and tapped the screen. The face that appeared was smooth, polished, and framed by a mane of distinguished silver hair. It belonged to Dr. Alistair Finch. He smiled, an unnervingly paternal expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. Evelyn's blood ran cold. Finch, the Dean Emeritus of Linguistics, the man who had chaired the committee that publicly vivisected her doctoral thesis, the man who had called her work a dangerous leap into computational fancy and single-handedly destroyed her career. "Evelyn," he began, his voice like honey and poison. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I know things between us ended contentiously. For my part in that, I am truly sorry." Evelyn said nothing. Her face was a stone. A predator does not apologize to its prey unless it wants something. Finch's smile tightened for a fraction of a second before relaxing again. "I'll get to the point," he said, shifting gears. "I'm calling on behalf of a client, a benefactor, you might say." Entirely anonymous, I'm afraid, but with considerable resources. He has a passion for the unsolvable, and he has set his sights on the Everest of all linguistic challenges. Finch leaned closer to his camera, his eyes gleaming. He wants to fund a definitive final attempt to decode the Voynich Manuscript. The name hung in the air between them, heavy with centuries of failure and obsession. The Voynich Manuscript. The book written in a language no one could read, filled with pictures of plants that no one could identify. The ultimate cryptological black hole. Finch continued his pitch, his voice a masterclass in persuasion. The terms are unconventional, he admitted, but I think you'll find them agreeable. First, absolute secrecy. No publications, no conferences, no contact with former colleagues. You would be a ghost. He paused, letting the irony land. Second, a stipend generous enough to fund your work and your life for the next 5 years, regardless of the outcome. Evelyn's stony expression didn't change, but her mind was racing. 5 years. It was a lifetime. It was freedom from the slow academic death she was currently suffering. And third, Finch said, delivering the masterstroke, you will be granted exclusive access to the brand new, highest resolution multispectral scans of the manuscript ever created. Every page, from infrared to ultraviolet, every fiber of the vellum, every microscopic trace of ink. More data than anyone has ever had to work with. He leaned back, the picture of magnanimity. My benefactor believes, as I have been convinced, that if the manuscript is a cipher, it will not be broken by a classicist or a historian. It will be broken by a data theorist, someone who can see the patterns others miss. Someone like you, Evelyn. He framed it as a compliment, but it felt like an accusation. This is your chance, he concluded softly. A chance to prove your methods on the one problem no one can solve. Evelyn finally found her voice, and it was as sharp as broken glass. Who is the benefactor? As I said, entirely anonymous, Finch deflected smoothly. His only desire is to see the puzzle solved. And what's your role in this, Alistair? Finder's fee? Finch chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. Merely a facilitator. Think of me as a humble project manager. I report on your progress. I manage the funds. That's all. He could feel her hesitating, could see the war behind her eyes. Consider this, Evelyn. If you fail, no one will ever know. Your name will not be attached to it. It will be a quiet, dignified affair. But if you succeed, success will be absolute, undeniable. The data will speak for itself. He had her. He knew it. He had targeted her core fear being wrong and her core desire being proven right with such mathematical certainty that no one could ever dispute it again. He moved in for the final, gentle push. I'm sending you a sample file, a single page, to whet your appetite. Let me know your decision by morning. The screen went blank, leaving Evelyn alone in the silent, sterile room with the ghost of an impossible offer. Night fell. The email from Finch sat unopened in her inbox, a digital temptation. Evelyn paced her small apartment, a caged animal. Pride warred with ambition. Her hatred for Finch was a physical, bitter taste in her mouth. But the manuscript, the Voynich, it was the problem every mind like hers dreamed of. A perfect, pristine mystery, untouched by mediocrity. To be the one to break it would not just be redemption. It would be apotheosis. Her fingers trembled slightly as she finally sat down and clicked the email open. A link. She clicked it. A download progress bar filled instantly. An image file bloomed onto her screen and the air left her lungs. It was a single page, rendered in such astonishing detail that she felt she could reach through the screen and touch the ancient vellum. The script flowed across the page in elegant, alien curves. It looked organic, like a system of vines or roots, yet it was arranged with clear, deliberate syntax. To the left of the text was an illustration, a plant, but it was a plant that life on Earth had never produced. It had the leaves of a fern, the roots of a pale, bloated mandrake, and a flower that bloomed like a gear mechanism, its petals interlocking like the parts of a clockwork device. It was beautiful and utterly, profoundly wrong. For a long moment, her academic rigor was forgotten, her skepticism washed away by a tide of pure, unadulterated awe. Then, the old instincts kicked in, a defense against the strange, irrational beauty. She saved the image and fed it into a terminal window, her fingers flying, commanding her own suite of analytical tools. She ran a frequency analysis on the text, a Glyphs matrix to map symbol relationships, a Shannon entropy calculator to measure its complexity. The results started to scroll up the screen, and she leaned closer, her awe now shifting into fascinated confusion. The patterns were bizarre. The word entropy was low, far too low for a hoax or a glossolalia of random scribbles. It had the structure of a real language, but the frequency distribution was flat, unlike any human tongue, which always favored certain letters over others. Some symbols appeared only at the beginning of words, others only at the end. It followed rules, but they were not human rules. It was a perfect, rule-violating phenomenon, a scientific impossibility, a ghost in the machine of language itself. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She looked from the baffling data on her terminal to the impossible flower on her main screen. The world narrowed to this single, perfect problem. Finch, her exile, her anger, it all burned away like fog in the sun. All that was left was the mystery. She opened her email client, pulled up the message from Finch, and typed a single word in reply. Accepted. She hit send before she could change her mind. The first delivery arrived 2 days after she accepted. Not a book, but a series of black shock-proof cases containing the heart of a ghost. Inside were solid-state drives, each holding a petabyte of raw, uncompressed data, the complete spectral soul of the Voynich Manuscript. Evelyn Reed, newly funded and utterly isolated, began to transform her home into a temple for this new, silent God. The days that followed blurred into a single continuous twilight, measured only by the rhythmic hum of cooling fans and the bitter taste of stale coffee. Her minimalist apartment disappeared beneath the raw machinery of her ambition. Server racks, delivered on pallets, were bolted together in her living room, a humming, blinking monolith that devoured electricity and spat out heat. Cables snaked across the floor like thick black vines. This was her new ecosystem, and she was the alpha predator within it. She christened her custom-built AI Lovelace. For weeks, she coded with feverish intensity, refining its neural networks, sharpening its analytical claws, and training it to hunt for patterns in the unlikeliest of places. Screens multiplied across her walls, displaying a dizzying array of data visualizations. Glyphs matrices shifted like kaleidoscope jewels. Probability trees branched into infinity, and complex charts mapped the manuscript's entropy against every known cipher, from Caesar shifts to the Vigenère square. Every test was a dead end. Every logical path led to a statistical brick wall. She barely ate, subsisting on a joyless diet of black coffee and chalky protein bars. Sleep became a grudging necessity, a period of forced downtime before she could return to the problem. The manuscript's bizarre imagery was her constant companion, her wallpaper on every monitor. The strange clockwork flowers, the baffling astronomical charts that corresponded to no known sky, and most unnervingly, the pages of pale naked women bathing in pools of green, interconnected by a series of impossible organic pipes. They stared out from the screens with blank, serene expressions, their secrets locked away behind a language that felt increasingly like a cosmic joke. Her frustration grew from a simmer to a rolling boil. She was a master codebreaker, armed with the most powerful analytical tool on the planet, and she was failing. The first crack appeared late one night, deep in the territory where exhaustion and obsession meet. Evelyn was staring at a line of text, a particularly stubborn passage that defied all models of linguistic sense. Her eyes burned from the screen's glare. Then something moved, a flicker, right at the edge of her vision. She snapped her head to the side. Nothing, just the shadows of the server racks, the steady red and green eyes of the machine staring back at her. She sighed, rubbing the bridge of her nose. "Too much caffeine, Evie," she muttered to herself. "Not enough sleep." She turned back to the screen and saw it again. This time, it was clearer. One of the looping, vine-like letters, a symbol that appeared frequently at the end of a phrase, seemed to subtly uncurl, stretching itself out like a waking cat before instantly snapping back into its proper shape. It happened in the space of a single, impossible heartbeat. She blinked hard, leaning closer to the monitor, her own heart suddenly pounding in her chest. The letter was perfectly still. Just ink on a digital page. She ran a diagnostic on the monitor, then on her own graphics card. Both were functioning perfectly. "Sleep deprivation," she said aloud, the words a charm to ward off the irrational, "causes minor visual artifacts. It's a documented phenomenon." She pushed herself away from the desk and walked to the small kitchen alcove to boil water for yet another coffee. Her back was to the wall of monitors. On the screen she had just been studying, the vine-like letter began to move again. Slowly, languidly, it unwound itself, its graceful curve straightening into a sharp, alien line. It held the impossible shape for a long, silent moment before coiling back into its textual form, freezing in place just as Evelyn turned around, coffee mug in hand. The screen was static. The anomaly was waiting. A week later, it happened. A high, clear chime echoed through the apartment. It was the sound she had been waiting for, the sound she had begun to believe she would never hear. Lovelace S. Discovery Alarm. Evelyn scrambled to her primary console, her heart hammering against her ribs. On the screen, a web of connections glowed a triumphant green. Lovelace had found it, a statistically significant pattern, a recurring root symbol whose positional frequency and relationship to adjacent glyphs were too consistent to be random. It was a potential proto-language element. The key. "Got you," she whispered, a fierce predatory grin spreading across her face. "You beautiful, impossible thing, I've got you." For the next 12 hours, she was a woman possessed by pure, triumphant reason. The exhaustion, the strange flickers on the screen, the gnawing frustration, it all vanished, burned away by the white-hot fire of a breakthrough. She worked feverishly, applying the newly discovered key to other sections of the manuscript. She fed the logic back into Lovelace, instructing it to use the root as a new baseline for its decryption algorithms, and the text began to yield. Letters and phonemes translated through the new filter began to pop up on the screen. It was gibberish, not just random letters, but a complex, syntactically perfect stream of absolute nonsense. It was a phantom language, a statistical ghost. The patterns were real, the structure was there, but it unlocked nothing. It was a lock that opened onto another, more complicated lock. It was a message that contained no message, an illusion of meaning so profound, so mathematically perfect, that it couldn't be an accident. Her breakthrough, her moment of triumph, collapsed into her single greatest failure. She stared at the screen, at the rivers of elegant nonsense, and for the first time, she felt a sliver of genuine fear, not of the supernatural, but of an intelligence, human or otherwise, so far beyond her own that it could design a puzzle with no solution. The video call from Finch came, as if on cue, when she was at her absolute lowest. She straightened her posture, ran a hand through her messy hair, and accepted the call, schooling her features into a mask of professional neutrality. Finch's polished face appeared, his paternal smile firmly in place. "Evelyn, I trust the week has been productive." She chose her words carefully, framing the failure as progress. I've managed to isolate and discount a major potential decryption path. It was a statistical anomaly, but a significant one. We now know one more thing the manuscript isn't. Finch's smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened with a familiar, condescending disappointment. Ah, a statistical ghost, then. I see. He let the silence hang for a moment, a subtle indictment. The benefactor is growing impatient for a more tangible result, Evelyn. He's not funding a process of elimination. Finch leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur. When I recommended you, I was met with some resistance, you know. They pointed to your past difficulties, your reputation for pursuing radical, unproven theories. I assured them that your unique approach would yield more than just elegant failures. He was twisting the knife, and he knew it. I had hoped your unique approach would yield more than statistical ghosts, Evelyn. She felt a hot flush of anger, but forced it down. The process is the process, Alistair. Science isn't magic. Of course not, he said smoothly, already backing away. Just keep me appraised. I'm sure a real breakthrough is just around the corner. The call ended. Evelyn stared at the black, reflective surface of the monitor. Her own face stared back, pale and exhausted. And for a moment, in the dark glass, it seemed as if the strange flowing symbols of the Voynich Manuscript were superimposed over her skin, like a tattoo she had not asked for, but had somehow earned. She was beginning to look less like the codebreaker, and more like the code itself. Failure was a catalyst. After Finch's call, the sting of his condescension propelled Evelyn not into despair, but into a colder, more granular focus. If Lovelace, with its godlike view of the data, couldn't find the pattern, it was because it was looking for the wrong thing. She had to get her own hands dirty. She abandoned the AIS macro-level analysis and began a manual microscopic examination of the multispectral scans, inch by painstaking inch. She was hunting for human error. A smudge of ink, a palimpsest where old text had been scraped away, anything a machine trained on perfection might overlook. Hours bled into one another. Her world shrank to the pixels on her screen. She cycled through the light spectra, peeling back layers of time. Infrared revealed the flow of the ink, the direction of the scribe's hand. Reflectance imaging highlighted the chemical composition of the pigments. Then, she switched to the ultraviolet layer. The page she was examining depicted a strange flower with a thick, gnarled root system, almost like a cluster of pale, intertwined fingers. Under the UV light, the image flared, hidden details emerging. It was in that moment of intense focus, staring at the screen, that reality tore open at the seams. It began with the roots. On the screen, the pale, finger-like projections began to writhe. They squirmed over one another like a nest of white serpents, twisting with a slow, sickening, organic motion. Evelyn's breath hitched. Her mind screamed artifact, screen-tearing, fatigue, but her eyes refused to accept the rationalization. Then, the flower itself began to move. The petals, arranged in a tight geometric bud, pulsed. They seemed to breathe, contracting and expanding in a slow, silent rhythm. A strangled yelp escaped her lips. She scrambled backward in her chair, a purely instinctual motion of flight, and collided with her desk. A precarious stack of research books toppled over, hitting the floor with a series of loud, percussive thuds that shattered the apartment to silence. She stood there, her body trembling, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, staring at the monitor. The image was perfectly still, a simple, static drawing of an impossible plant. But she had seen it. It was not a flicker in her periphery. It was a clear, undeniable, animated event. Her senses, the very tools of her scientific trade, had just lied to her with breathtaking conviction. The apartment was no longer a laboratory. It was a contaminated zone. Evelyn fled. She grabbed her keys and her laptop and didn't stop until she was surrounded by the anonymous, sterile safety of the main university library. The silence here was different from the silence in her apartment. It was a public, shared silence, policed by librarians and insulated by the presence of other people. She found a secluded carrel in the back and tried to force her breathing back into a normal rhythm. Her mind, desperate for a rational framework, latched onto the only possible explanation. She wasn't going mad. She was experiencing a psychological phenomenon precipitated by the manuscript's unique history. She had to understand the madness of the source to understand her own reaction to it. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, not searching for cryptological analysis, but for history, for superstition. She fell down a rabbit hole of forgotten lore. She pulled up academic articles on John Dee, Queen Elizabeth S. court astrologer and occultist, who had owned the manuscript in the 16th century and was rumoured to have believed it was the language of angels. She read about Athanasius Kircher, the 17th century Jesuit scholar who became obsessed with the book, certain it held the secrets of alchemy and the philosopher Stone. The names and theories piled up. It was a lost text of the Cathars, a secret herbal manual from a matriarchal cult, a work of glossolalia by a medieval mystic. She scoffed as she read, muttering pseudoscience and confirmation bias under her breath, but she couldn't stop. With a kind of horrified compulsion, she devoured the stories, the occult theories, the hermetic traditions. Each superstitious claim was another brick in the wall she was trying to build, around the terrifying, writhing image in her memory. She wasn't looking for magic. She was looking for a case study in shared delusion, a historical precedent for insanity that could explain the fresh, new madness blooming in her own mind. She returned to her apartment that night, the scent of old library books still clinging to her clothes. The occult histories, instead of comforting her, had only made the mystery feel darker, more tangled. She sat at her desk, staring at the static image of the serpent-rooted flower, and a new idea began to brew, an idea born not of superstition, but of pure data forensics. The vellum. The book wasn't just the ink, it was the medium itself. What if there was data hidden, not in the pigments, but in the parchment? Early modern scribes often reuse parchment, scraping off old text. What if there were microscopic variations, indentations, or topographical changes invisible to any single light spectrum? A new energy surged through her. This was a testable hypothesis. This was science. She called up Lovelace, her fingers flying with renewed purpose. She instructed the AI to perform a differential analysis, comparing every spectral layer of a single page against every other layer, hunting for microscopic variations in height and density. It was a computational task of staggering complexity, something no one had ever thought to do. She set the program to run and pace the apartment, a caged tiger waiting for the data to roar. Hours later, the familiar chime of a discovery echoed through the room. She lunged for the console. Lovelace had found something. It wasn't a language. It was a series of faint, almost invisible markings, like microscopic scars embedded in the vellum itself, hidden beneath the ink of the primary text. A hidden layer of code. A wave of triumphant, giddy relief washed over Evelyn. She laughed aloud, the sound startling in the quiet room. It wasn't magic. It wasn't a curse or a ghost. It was just more data. The hallucination had been stress, a simple trick of a tired mind. But this was real, hard, verifiable proof. She had been right all along. She felt vindicated, brilliant, and completely, rationally sane. Dawn was breaking, painting the city outside her window in shades of grey and bruised purple. With trembling, victorious hands, Evelyn fed the new hidden symbols into Lovelace's main decryption engine. She leaned back in her chair, a smug smile on her face, waiting for the secrets of the Voynich Manuscript to finally spill onto her screen in plain, simple English. The result was immediate, and it was chilling. Lovelace's output wasn't a translation. It wasn't even gibberish. It was a classification report. The AI cross-referenced the new symbols against every known linguistic and symbolic database in the world and found no matches. Instead, it offered a statistical comparison. The patterns, it reported with cold machine certainty, did not resemble language. They more closely resembled diagrams of active neural pathways. The branching, flowing structures mirrored the complex firing of synapses in a human brain, or the intricate folding of proteins at a molecular level. Evelyn stared at the report, her triumphant smile frozen on her face. Neural pathways, molecular biology, it made no sense. As she tried to process the information, a low hum began to emanate from her computer speakers. It started subtly, a barely audible bass frequency, but it grew steadily in volume and intensity. And within the hum, she could hear them, the whispers, the phantom syllables she had heard before, but now they were clear, layered, a chorus of nonsensical voices speaking right inside her head. The screen displaying the neural pathway diagrams suddenly flashed, replaced by a brilliant high-resolution image of one of the manuscript's star charts. The strange, alien constellations burned with an inner light. The hum and the whispers rose to a crescendo, and a sudden, violent wave of vertigo crashed over her. The floor seemed to drop away. She wasn't in her apartment anymore. She was falling endlessly through a silent, star-dusted void, the impossible constellations of the Voynich Manuscript rushing past her on all sides. Her scientific discovery had not been a door out of the madness. It was a key, and she had just used it to unlock a much, much darker room. The fall had no end and no beginning. It was a silent, eternal plunge through a cosmos of alien stars. When Evelyn finally returned to herself, she was slumped on the floor of her apartment, the echo of 1,000 whispering voices still ringing in her ears. The sun was up. A new day had begun, but the world she had woken up in was not the same one she had left behind. The line between data and delirium had been erased. A week later, the apartment was unrecognizable. It was no longer a lab, but a nest, a chaotic den woven from paper and obsession. Every surface was buried under printouts of the Voynich Manuscript. The elegant alien script covered the tables, the chairs, the floor. Half-eaten containers of food sat on the counter, forgotten, a sour, sweet smell of decay beginning to permeate the air. In the center of the room, a large whiteboard was covered in hand-drawn symbols, copies of the manuscript's bizarre botanical shapes and astrological charts, connected by a frantic web of lines and question marks. And in the middle of it all was Evelyn. She was a wraith. Her clothes were rumpled, her face was gaunt and pale, and her eyes, wide and bloodshot, seemed to be staring at something no one else could see. She had abandoned the cold distance of the computer. Now, her work was tactile, physical. She would stand before the whiteboard for hours, a marker in her hand, tracing the elegant curves of a symbol over and over again, as if trying to learn its shape with her muscles, not just her mind. She muttered to herself constantly, not in frantic ramblings, but in a low, intense tone, as if she were in a deep debate with an unseen colleague. No, the spiral isn't a suffix, she would whisper to the empty room. It's a catalyst. It signifies a change of state, not a change of meaning. She was no longer trying to decode the text. She was trying to commune with it. One night, deep in her work, she heard a new sound, cutting through the constant hum of the servers. It was the soft, distinct sound of splashing water. It was gentle, rhythmic, and coming from the middle of her living room. Evelyn slowly lifted her head from a page she was studying. The sound continued, unhurried, a soft, liquid lapping. She turned in her chair, her heart a slow, heavy drum. Standing there, in the space between the couch and the server racks, was a figure. It was translucent, shimmering at the edges like a heat haze on a summer road. It was one of the women from the manuscript, her form pale and naked, her hairless head tilted slightly as if listening to a faraway sound. The figure was ankle-deep in a pool of shimmering, invisible water, the source of the splashing sound. She looked at Evelyn, her eyes as empty and serene as the figures in the drawings, offering no threat, no communication, only a calm, impossible presence. The Evelyn of 2 weeks ago would have screamed. She would have run. But this new Evelyn, the one who had fallen through the stars and whispered to symbols on a whiteboard, did not. A deep, cold terror washed over her, but it was accompanied by a new, more powerful feeling. A terrifying, all-consuming, scholarly curiosity. The apparition held her gaze for a long moment, then slowly began to dissolve, fading from the bottom up like smoke, until nothing was left but the silence and the hum of the machines. Evelyn slowly rose to her feet. She walked to the spot where the figure had stood and raised a trembling hand, her fingers tracing the empty air where this impossible being had just been. The barrier was gone. The world of the manuscript was no longer confined to the page. It was bleeding into hers, and she was no longer sure she wanted to stop it. She was no longer a scientist observing a phenomenon. She was becoming part of it. The next day, the video call chime shattered her concentration. It was Finch. His face appeared on the screen, arranged in a mask of deep, professional concern. "Evelyn," he began, his tone gentle. "It's been over a week since your last update. The benefactor is anxious. How is the project progressing?" Evelyn, disheveled and wild-eyed, looked into the camera, but her focus seemed to be on a point somewhere beyond it. "Progress is accelerating," she said, her voice a strange, calm monotone. "I was wrong before, Alistair. I was looking at it as a cryptological problem, a cipher, but it's not a language." Finch's brow furrowed slightly. "Then what is it?" "It's a recipe," Evelyn said, a strange light entering her eyes. "It's an alchemical instruction set for altering perception. The symbols aren't words, they're catalysts. They interact with the human mind directly." She gestured to the empty space in her living room. "The apparitions are becoming more frequent, but they aren't ghosts. They're data points, manifestations of the text's core function." Finch's expression of concern slowly hardened, the paternal mask melting away to reveal the cold fury of the establishment gatekeeper beneath. He stared at her, at the chaotic apartment visible behind her, at her gaunt face and rambling, esoteric explanations. He was not looking at a brilliant scientist on the verge of a breakthrough. He was looking at a woman who had suffered a complete and catastrophic mental breakdown. "I see," he said, his voice now like chips of ice. "Evelyn, under the terms of our agreement, I am required to assess the project's viability. Based on what you have just told me and what I am seeing, I am making the decision to terminate the project, effective immediately." Evelyn just stared at him, the strange light in her eyes dimming slightly. "A team will be at your apartment tomorrow morning at 9 to collect the hardware and the drives," Finch continued, his tone cold and clinical. "Your access to the server and the scan data will be revoked in 1 hour. The remainder of your stipend will be paid out. I'm sorry it came to this, Evelyn." He didn't sound sorry at all. He sounded vindicated. The call ended. The screen went black. 1 hour. He was taking it all away. He was declaring her mad, just like they had all those years ago. He was burying her work, her discovery. She looked from the dark screen to the whiteboard covered in her frantic drawings. He thought he was taking her work. He didn't understand. The work wasn't on the servers anymore. It was in her. The countdown clock on Evelyn's monitor was a digital heartbeat, marking the final hour of her professional life. 59:43, 59:42. A strange, desperate calm had settled over her, the kind of clarity that comes when all other options have been burned away. Finch could take the machines. He could take the data. But he couldn't take what was happening inside her own mind. The proof she now sought wasn't for him, or for the anonymous benefactor, or for the world that had cast her out. It was for her. With a fluid, deliberate motion, she rose from her chair and walked to the wall behind the main server rack. Her fingers found the thick, braided power cords. One by one, she pulled them from the wall sockets. The roaring hum of the cooling fans died with a choked whine, replaced by an immediate, ringing silence. Then she pulled the Ethernet cable, severing the connection to the outside world. She was alone now, truly alone, in a silent room with a dying clock and a secret centuries old. She returned to her desk. 47:16. She ignored the timer and pulled up a specific file, the final, most complex of the manuscript's astronomical pages. It was a dizzying mandala of nested circles, interconnected star patterns and glyphs arranged in spiraling arms, like a galaxy unto itself. This was the master diagram. She knew it instinctively. On a secondary monitor, she opened a blank workspace. Then, acting on a logic that had nothing to do with linguistics and everything to do with the whispers in her head, she began her final work. She stopped trying to read the symbols. She stopped trying to translate. Instead, she began to move them. She clicked and dragged individual glyphs from the scanned manuscript, arranging them on the blank screen, not in lines of text, but in a new pattern, a new constellation. She mirrored the spatial relationships from the star chart, placing the symbols not according to syntax, but according to their position in the cosmic diagram. It was no longer an act of science. She was a believer, performing a ritual. She was arranging the pieces of a key, praying it would fit the lock. As she dragged the final, intricate symbol into its appointed place at the center of the spiraling pattern, the world stopped. The countdown clock froze at 02:17. Every monitor, all at once, went black. The silence was absolute for a single heartbeat. And then a new sound emerged from the speakers, not a whisper, not a hum, but a single, pure, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of her bones. The air in the room grew instantly, unnaturally cold, raising goosebumps on her arms. And then, light. The pages of the manuscript she had pinned to her walls began to glow, emitting a faint, ethereal golden light, turning the chaotic room into a holy space. The light pulsed in time with the resonant tone. Evelyn sat frozen in her chair, her face bathed in the golden glow. Her eyes, wide and staring, rolled back in her head, and the universe poured in. It was not a thought. It was not a vision. It was a torrent of pure, raw understanding that bypassed language entirely. She experienced the crushing weight of deep time, the billion-year march of cosmic dust coalescing into stars. She felt the chill of alien biology, the slow, cold-blooded thoughts of organisms that lived and died in methane seas under a foreign sun. She understood the universe not as a collection of dead matter, but as a single, vast, thinking organism, and humanity as a fleeting, feverish dream in its consciousness. And the manuscript was a recipe, a set of instructions. It was a technology encoded in symbol and pigment, designed to find a compatible primate brain and systematically rewire its neural pathways, forcing it to perceive this greater, terrifying reality. It wasn't a message in a bottle. It was a key, designed to rewrite the lock. The psychic explosion was silent, overwhelming, and absolute. She finally had her answer. The knowledge was everything, and it was too much. The sharp, splintering crack of the apartment door breaking open was the first sound to pierce the morning silence. Two grim-faced technicians in matching black polo shirts burst into the room, followed closely by a nervous-looking Alistair Finch. They stopped dead in the doorway, taking in the scene. The room was dark and cold. The walls were a chaotic mess of papers, many of which now lay on the floor, and in the middle of it all, Evelyn sat in her chair, utterly catatonic. She was staring blankly ahead, her face a serene, empty mask. She didn't blink. She didn't breathe. The only light in the room came from a single monitor, which glowed with a soft, hypnotic light. One of the technicians cautiously approached the desk. On the screen was a single symbol. It was elegant, complex, and looked vaguely familiar, like a cousin to the Voynich script. But it was a symbol that did not exist anywhere in the manuscript. It was new. Finch moved to stand behind the technician, his face a mixture of pity and disgust. "I told you," he muttered. "A complete psychotic break." Then he saw the wall behind the monitor. Scrawled in thick black marker, in Evelyn's own handwriting, were 5 words. "It's not a language, it's a recipe." Finch stared at the words, then at the catatonic woman in the chair. He sighed, a weary sound of a problem being dealt with. "All right," he said to his men. "Bag the evidence. Wipe the drives. Everything." As the second technician moved to shut down the computer, the first one remained frozen for a moment longer, his eyes fixed on the new, glowing symbol on the screen. His brow furrowed in confusion, his mind trying to process the impossible shape. And just for a fleeting moment, a flicker of something crossed his face, not just confusion, but a dawning, horrified understanding, as if the symbol was speaking to a part of his brain that he didn't know existed. He shook his head sharply, as if to clear it, and turned away to get to work, the silent, terrifying invitation of the recipe left glowing in the dark behind him. What a fascinating and unsettling story. On the surface, it's about breaking a code, the ultimate rational puzzle. But the journey of Dr. Evelyn Reed asks a much deeper question. What happens when our tools of reason are not just wrong, but entirely irrelevant? Evelyn begins with the purest form of modern science data analysis, AI, and the core belief that any problem can be solved if you just have enough information. Yet the Voynich Manuscript doesn't respond to analysis. It seems to demand participation. It refuses to be an object of study and instead becomes an active force, something that studies her. Her final breakthrough isn't an act of intellect, but an act of surrender. She stops trying to impose human logic on the manuscript and instead adopts its alien intuitive rules. And in doing so, she gets her answer. The terrifying truth she uncovers, however, isn't a formula or a sentence she can publish. It's a personal, transformative experience that costs her everything. She proves the superstition right, but the proof itself is a kind of madness that science cannot measure or accept. It leaves us with a truly difficult question about the nature of discovery. If a truth cannot be shared, measured, or proven to others, does it still count as knowledge? Let me know what you think in the comments.